An old Coast Guard saying goes something along the lines of, you have to go out, but you don't have to come back. While some may scratch their heads at it, those located in Alaska's Gulf know exactly what the phrase implies. In Sitka, the Coast Guard is a group of elite individuals that present a united and unflinching front for those who step onto a chopper and fly out to the rescue of commercial fishermen. Their easygoing nature, coupled with the bond the group has formed, is not by accident. The men and women who serve on Sitka's Coast Guard are chosen for their honor, their commitment, and their willingness to step onto a craft that flies into some of the most vicious waters in the world, where they try to bring home those in need and sometimes, despite their best efforts, find themselves in their own grave. Welcome back to Tragedy with a View. I'm your host, Kayla, and I have my friend Michelle with me today.
Hi there.
For a second attempt because
Michelle didn't have her microphone on the first time.
I was a terrible podcast producer and forgot to do all of my checks that Sam tells me all the time. He's like, you need a checklist and just like check the things every single time.
And you're like, no, I got this.
And I'm like, no, I've done this almost 50 times now.
Right.
As long as you don't mess with the on-off or switch. Yeah, so with that, then, if some of this sounds like, oh, it sounds kind of like you're droning on about something that you've talked about before, it's because we have talked about it before.
We've already done this once.
Yeah, we got like 90% of the way through, and then Michelle realized that her microphone was off, and so here we go again. If you are listening to this on the day it's released, October 16th, today is your last day to get pre-ordered merch. This is your only option to get the new designs because I'm not keeping stock in them. So if you want something, be sure to check them out. If you are curious about the sweatshirt designs and how they look on the sweatshirt, I included the picture of the design where I designed it, and it pretty much transfers directly onto the shirt. So even though like if you look at the shirt and you're like, that looks a little iffy, I promise you it's not. It's just the way that the program laid out the stuff. It looks like splotchy, but it's not. I ordered samples, so
you should definitely get one.
You should definitely get one. And for everyone who has already purchased, thank you so much. I truly appreciate it. So thank you if you've already purchased. I will be putting the link in the description for this episode. If you are listening to this October 17th or on, I'm so sorry. I'm not keeping stock in these. So if you're not on social media or you don't follow us on social media, then you would have no idea that this was happening. So I'm sorry about that too. But I'm thinking probably in the summer, I'll do like a relaunch and maybe do a different design and have like tank tops and long sleeves and some cooler weather items as well. So one other thing that I want to mention in regards to talking about some of these stories that are just really tragic and people die and why I want to talk about it is because for the people who have lost loved ones, the only way to keep them alive is to continue to talk about them and to honor their memory. And especially when it comes to people who are stepping into situations where they're putting their lives at risk to rescue others. I think that's really important to highlight their actions and what they've done and what they've sacrificed along the way as well. And so it's an attempt to keep people's loved ones alive, and this is the way that I know how to do it.
I love that notion, Kayla. So I have a really good friend who passed away, and then my dad passed away 5 years ago, and I tend not to talk about them. And Amanda and I had a very long conversation about my friend. He just recently passed away, and unfortunately, it was by death by suicide. And she was talking about that. Like, you need to process it. You need to talk about it. That's how you're going to honor his memory and honor him.
Yeah.
Because he was an amazing person. And that really hit me because I don't talk about it. So these stories are amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of why I like to talk about some of these things. I know Sam has questioned me on more than one occasion about why I like talking about death. And it's not so much that I like talking about death as I like talking about the people. And so if you noticed, all summer long when Sam was doing the episodes with me, we didn't really do too many stories where people died. There were a couple, but he doesn't view that the same way that I do.
It's intriguing to me how, I mean, working for hospice, right? I deal with people who die every day, but it's very intriguing how different people handle the process of dying and then the aftermath of the grief.
Yeah.
I can definitely see Sam not wanting to.
Do you want to talk about your car?
Oh,
It's not your car,
it's not my car.
but it's good information for people.
I mean, it's a good story. It's a happy ending.
Yes. We'll start with a happy ending story.
Start with a happy ending story. I mean, we are talking about tragedy and heroism. And the way out here to Kayla's house, there was a car accident that had just occurred. I didn't see it occur, but it had just occurred, and there was a car fully engulfed in a ditch upside down, and no one had called 911, and no one was around. So I quickly jumped into action and jumped out of my car, and another man stopped, and I was like, "You call 911! You help me open this door!" And it was like one of those commercials that you see on the CPR training.
Yeah.
You know, you do this, you do that.
Someone had to take charge, and it was you.
Well, I mean, being an ex-firefighter and now currently a nurse, right? Like, you just jump into action.
You don't even. Yeah, when you
see, you just go.
Yeah, when you see something like that, especially like when you can very easily acknowledge that no one's already doing that role. Right. Like, it's so easy to just like step into it. And I think as someone who is not a nurse or a ex-firefighter or like in any sort of thing like that, I think the thing that you mentioned was that she wasn't, the ditch wasn't full of water, luckily. Like,
right, there's no water.
Yeah, we're in a drought season, all over. So there was no water. And so you were like, I wasn't going to take her out. Like, I was going to wait for somebody else to do that.
Yeah, so we pried the door open, and having the experience, right? Like, you don't just extract people, because obviously her car rolled and flipped several times, right? So you have to think about spinal cord injury, head injury, traumatic brain injury, possible brain bleed that you can't see. So there are all kinds of things, right, that go through your mind. So that's the purpose of the collar and the backboard.
Yeah.
My biggest concern was when we couldn't see inside the car. There's a human in there. How many humans? Are they alive?
Yes.
Right? Like,
is there a child?
Because it was like around possibly dropping kids off at school time, because this is very early in the morning. This morning that we're taping this. But so once we finally got the door pried open just enough for me to squeak in there, she was talking. She was alert. She was oriented. She knew her name. She knew her birthday. She could move her limbs. She said nothing hurt. She was definitely contorted in the car in a very odd position, but I just sat in there with her and waited. And and then paramedics quickly got there, and then I just snuck out, and here I am.
Yeah. So if you ever come across an accident, there you go. Take charge and just sit with the person and let them, talk to them, ask their name. Don't remove a person until a paramedic. Paramedics.
Or Promedica.
Or Promedica.
Whoever shows up on scene.
Promedica is a hospital in our area, a hospital system. So that's why my brain went there. Until paramedics get there, and then go do a podcast
It's a great day.
Okay,
and it's not even 10 o'clock yet.
Yo, it's early. I felt like that was just such a brat thing to say. Yo, it's early. Okay. So the area we are talking about today in this story is called Prince William Sound. It is about 150 miles or 220 kilometers south of Anchorage. And a little bit more specifically, when you're looking at the state of Alaska, there's a section of land that runs along with the Canadian border that butts up against the Pacific Ocean. And this area is like very dotted with islands and channels and like sandbars and land masses and glaciers.
There's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot going on.
On the map, there's a lot going on, and then it's not like you're not in real life time. So who knows how many glaciers or sandbars are present that don't show on the map.
Yeah. So this area is it is still considered Alaska. It butts up next to British Columbia, Canada, and this area also includes Alaska's capital, which is Juneau. As we've discussed in previous episodes, Alaska is a ginormous and beautiful and wild place to be. Alaska is known as the last frontier for a reason, and the sheer vastness of space between communities allows for the most pristine wilderness to thrive. Alaska sits in the subarctic and Arctic ranges, meaning that there's plenty of permafrost that supports massive glaciers. It is also home to Denali, which is the largest mountain from base to summit above the waterline.
20,310 feet to be exact.
Yes. And as we mentioned last time,
which no one will ever hear.
I mean, I guess I could crop out my version of it or like what I was saying and add it in, but that would get tedious and we're just starting over.
But time crunch now.
Yeah. Everest, of course, is the most like iconic tall point. Like that's the peak that people try to reach because it's the tallest point in the world. Base of Everest, though, sits up higher than what I guess in comparison to Denali does. So Denali's base sits at a much lower elevation, making the climb to the summit longer than Everest. I think the only mountain that's taller is technically an underwater mountain. I don't know how you would climb a underwater mountain, but if anybody figures that out, scuba diving.
Someone who is scared of drowning will never figure that out.
Yeah. I'm scared of dark water, so
same.
That's all I got. I'm not really scared of drowning. Doesn't usually cross my mind, but it's more like you don't know what's in that water.
You don't know what's in that water.
So,
and being someone who doesn't necessarily, Kayla, love heights, how do you feel about climbing a mountain, Mount Everest?
It's not necessarily the heights that would bother me. It's the precariousness of a fall. And as long as there was enough of a trail that was like, I didn't need to actually go like rock climbing for a significant portion of a climb, I feel pretty comfortable. Like as long as both my feet can be on the ground.
Right.
And like there's potential that like if I really needed to, I could sit down and just slide.
Sure. Like we climbed what was that? The fire
fire tower.
The fire tower.
That like went up above the tree line, and I was like, don't look down. Don't look down.
You did
Don't
great.
Look down. Yeah. I mean, there absolutely would be parts where I would have to just mentally get over it. But mountain climbing is on the list of things. Sam and I are looking at doing something next year. So moving on, we're clearly getting sidetracked this morning. There are thousands upon thousands of miles of coastline associated with Alaska, and it is home to a boreal and coastal forest. In addition to this, there are volcanoes that exist in Alaska, some of those being Pavlov, which is the most active volcano in Alaska, Nova Rupta, which is located in Katmai National Park and produced the largest eruption in the 20th century. And then there is Redoubt, which is part of the Pacific Ring of Fire. Prince William Sound is a vital part of the commercial fishing industry in Alaska. There are a total of 3,800 miles or 6,115 kilometers of coastline in Prince William Sound alone. This area also gets so much rain that there is a rainforest here, and there are 150 glaciers in this area, 17 of which are the tidewater glaciers, which are glaciers that are in water. And I can guarantee you've seen them because they're the ones that like people take videos off of boats from, where part of the glacier breaks off and it collapses into the water. And then there's like, you know, the waves and the glacier, or some people might also call like the section that breaks off an iceberg, kind of like flips around and it does some crazy things, and they're pretty cool.
I didn't realize that there are different types of glaciers.
Yeah. Even though this area is rugged and wild, it is relatively easy to get to, and couple that with the abundance of wildlife and sea and fish, it is a prime location to attract commercial fishermen like Skip Holden. Skip grew up sailing with his father in California, and thanks to this, he learned how to navigate in open waters, tie reliable knots, and make temporary repairs on the water, as well as fix more significant repairs once he docked his boat. Skip and his wife Marlene, not to be confused with his boat, which he also named Marlene, hitchhiked their way to Alaska from San Leandro, California, chasing a dream. Once in Alaska, they both got a job at a cannery, and as soon as they saved $1,200, they purchased a boat and started a new life. As commercial fishermen, they lived and fished on this boat, but it had pretty meager additions when it came to the living part. For example, there wasn't a bathroom on board, so they just used a bucket. Skip named the boat after his wife, so it's called the fishing vessel Marlene, and the boat had a reel on the deck at the front, which had the capacity to feed out and then pull in a 1,000 foot or 300 meter long gill net. After 8 years of hard work, he had experience and began to build a crew to fish with, but typically Skip would work alone in the area of the Copper River Flats. This area also had a mile-wide sandbar, which, depending on the tide and the weather, would either be open and able to pass over in their boats, or it would close off and any boats stuck outside would be stuck in the open waters for potentially days as they were pummeled by a storm. This sandbar, though, would provide a source of wave breaks and therefore protection during storms, but this also meant that boats were unable to pass over it due to the violent nature of the waters. Because of this, Skip had a very strong habit of abandoning whatever he was working on and making it inside of the sandbar if he heard the news over his CB radio that it was closing.
But does he?
But we wouldn't really have a story if he actually did that. It was August 6th, 1981, and Skip had already been going for about 2 days and 2 nights, essentially just waiting for some inconvenient weather to pass. As soon as it did, he set out fishing. He quickly realized, though, that the swells were still larger than he expected them to be, and they were behaving oddly in comparison to what he was used to, such as they weren't breaking and they just seemed to roll really consistently, which inherently doesn't sound bad. But what really set him on edge was that the air seemed to be extremely calm, like he says it was out of breath. It didn't take long, though, and the air caught her breath, so to speak, and a storm began to take shape again. At this time, the tide had been going out, and as it did, the stormy weather was pressing waves against the tide and creating a perilous frenzy of waves cresting and breaking in every direction.
And then not to mention, right, like then you have the undercurrent and the undertows.
Yes.
That is just swirling.
There's things going on under the water that you can't tell being on the surface of the water, which is a whole nother reason to be scared of water.
Right. And then there's a large majority of your boat that is under the water.
Yes.
Right. That is being affected.
Yes. Which is, I mean, so in my head, I know that a lot of people who have boats have anchors. And assumably, as someone who's not a boater, an actual anchor is probably the best thing to use because it's going to get past, theoretically speaking, of course, it's going to get past the surface level currents that are doing their own thing, the underwater currents that are doing something else, and kind of like root in the sand or the mud or muck or whatever is underneath.
Rooting in is the key.
Yeah.
And if you have everything that's going on underneath, can it root in, right? Or is those undercurrents so violent that it's just not allowing, right?
Yeah.
Like it's churning the sand or the mud that's down there.
Yeah. And so something that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, Skip doesn't have an anchor.
So many questions for Skip. Like, A, where was Marlene? B, if he quickly decided that the swells were not what he expected, why did we keep going?
Yep.
C, did he not look at some sort of weather radar or something to decide that it was healthy to go out? But again, like I think we talked about this the other day when we
didn't record.
Didn't record. He was a vagabond, so he just didn't. I mean, hitchhike and $1,200. I mean, that says it all right there.
Yeah.
Oh, these little waves aren't going to hurt me.
Yeah. And kind of circling back, Skip doesn't have an anchor on his boat, which I don't know if there's a reason for that, because he does have the gill net, which he uses as a little bit of an anchor. But then as that gill net goes under the surface layer of the water, it's getting caught up by whatever's going on under the surface. And then that's controlling your boat versus,
right. But I don't know. Like, so I'm not a fisherman, and certainly not commercial fisherman. So are you supposed to move with the gill net?
So from my understanding, from what I've read here and along with other stories that I've read, people will use nets or buoys or something along those lines to basically act as a stabilizer to keep their boats oriented with the waves, so that way they're not like turning to the side and then eventually getting capsized. That's my understanding of like the purpose of those things. But unlike with buoys, a gill net goes under the water.
Right.
So if the currents are strong enough to take that gill net and like pull them out to the ocean, kind of like what Skip was experiencing, we'll come to, that almost seems more terrifying to me.
Again, we already talked, like, you don't know what's under the water. So
you don't know
what you're being pulled to.
Yeah.
Or into.
Skip originally tries to return to the sandbar, but the waves are breaking so aggressively across the now diminishing waters, again, due to the tide going out, there is no way to retreat to the calmer waters of the inland bay. As he began to maneuver through the waters again, he spotted a light off of another salmon boat. This boat seemed to be maneuvering in a way that implied to Skip that he was showing the way through the 5,000 feet or 1,500 meters of breaking waves toward deeper waters of the main channel. Once he made it, Skip began trying to find another opening along the 60 miles or 98 kilometers of sandbar. Here he could see Egg Island, which is a small island in Prince William Sound, and there are several of these islands throughout the area. And at this point, he decided to use his CB radio to call his friend Phil. Phil Thrum is a fishing friend of Skip's, and Skip knew that he was back in the safety of calmer waters past the sandbar. So Skip gets to the point immediately, asking if there was a way in or past the sandbar that Phil knew of, and Phil responded saying that he didn't think so, and from what he could see, the entire sandbar was unable to be crossed. Another voice cut in to confirm that there was no way in. This voice was an anonymous fisherman who had ended up on the same radio channel that Skip and Phil were using. Skip and Phil were not the only ones on this channel. Others had been listening in, trying to find their own way or help those who were stuck. And as anonymous fishermen said those words, the response seemed deafening as those stuck on the wrong side of the sandbar realized what they had to do. and that would be to wait out the storm no matter how long it would last. At this point, the winds were sustaining 60 miles per hour or 97 kilometers per hour, but this did not last long.
And this is his house. Mm-hmm. This is his home, right? So what else can he do? I mean, a lot of people are like, oh, $1,200. It's $1,200 boat. Big deal. But
yeah,
this is his home.
Well, I mean, also it was in the 80s, which is a different, time currency than what is now. So $1,200, I mean, $1,200 today is still not like an obnoxious amount. But for someone who hitchhiked from California to Alaska and was working in a cannery so that way he could afford to buy a boat and get out on the water, which is what he wanted to do, like that's a big deal.
That is a big deal.
So the gusts soon kicked up and were rushing by at over 80 miles per hour or 129 kilometers per hour. And this could have been managed a bit better had the steering on the fishing vessel Marlene not gone out. The waves and winds were quickly turning the fishing vessel Marlene to the side so that the waves were hitting broadside or on the side of the boat. Without steering, Skip was worried about the waves completely turning him to the side, which would have made it more likely for him to capsize. And the other problem was that without steering, he was out of control and the waves were pulling him straight towards the rocks and cliff edges that dotted the area. So in order to bring some stability and hopefully catch an undercurrent that could pull the fishing vessel Marlene away from the dangerous rocks, Skip let out about 750 feet or 230 meters of his 1,000-foot gill net. So roughly 3/4 of this net he let out. At this time, Skip's friend Phil called him again, asked him how he was doing, and if he wanted Phil to call the Coast Guard. Skip replied saying that he was alive and that if a rescue basket was to drop down on his deck, he would happily crawl inside. But the weather was too bad. There was no way the Coast Guard could get close to anyone on the waters. The storm only seemed to feed off of the turmoil of the ocean and continued to grow stronger. Winds soon raged past 90 miles per hour or 145 kilometers per hour. When Skip returned to the wheelhouse, he heard his engine coughing and he quickly pulled up the floorboard to check on the engine, and what he saw gave him a pause. He had left the wheelhouse door open to help try to air out some of the fumes that the engine was putting off, while at the same time, dense rain had been coming in and the engine compartment was now nearly flooded. Deciding that he could only tackle one thing at a time, he set to shutting down the engine so that way he could carefully remove the water from the engine compartment. To do this, he removed floorboards so that way he was able to climb inside. The water at this point was already up to his chest, but after more than an hour of careful and dedicated bailing, the compartment was mostly empty of water. But now the engine wouldn't start back up.
It's just keeps going. It's just bad to worse.
Yeah.
He's bailing for an hour all the while wondering, am I going to live?
Where's my boat going?
Where's my boat going? Am I going to live? And he's down in this engine compartment bailing
Water so that way his engine doesn't get drowned, essentially. And then he gets the water out and he tries to start the engine and it's like, nah, I needed a break. The storm, meanwhile, had pulled the fishing vessel Marlene into an area known as the Pocket between Softuck and Strawberry, which are landmark areas of sandbar and channel entrances. Thanks to the layout, waters were known to be brutal, and many boats that became stuck in this area would be destroyed if the operators could not get them out. Phil, at this point, again calls Skip and asks for an update and if he wanted him to call the Coast Guard. This area he was in was an absolute death trap. Skip's CB radio would not reach the Coast Guard due to the distance being too far for his radio to reach. And with Skip being unable to call a mayday himself, he relayed his predicament to Phil and asked him what he thought.
Everyone needs a friend like Phil.
Everyone needs a Phil. Because if there's something that you should know about the commercial fishermen in Alaska, they don't call for help. Like, generally speaking, it's just not something that they do for whatever reason.
Is it because there's a multitude of them and they don't want to exhaust help unnecessarily? I mean, we could get into a whole conversation about, is this an ego thing, or is this just, they just handle it?
I think I for sure think it's an ego thing.
Okay.
Fishing in Alaska is probably a pretty high risk, high reward job. And there's probably, I would assume, and I could be incorrect here, but I would assume that there's probably like a license limit for how many fishermen can be on the water in a certain area. And it's probably at its max at all times. And there's a wait list. And so they might not get a license because they're costing money for the government. And then they know that they're not just going to be able to get on the water again. They're going to have to go essentially on this wait list and wait in line and then re-wait their turn. That's what makes sense in my own head. I could be completely wrong about that, but it sounds to me like there's also like, you know, only the most hardcore fishers can survive out there and they don't need help because they'll go down with their boat. Sure. Type of mindset.
Okay, so if there are any commercial fishermen in Alaska listening, please reach out to Kayla.
Yeah, let me know. Let me know if I'm on point or if there's like a completely different thing going on, because I will talk about it. I'll give an update.
Skip, if you're listening.
Yeah. Come on the podcast, Skip. We have questions for you.
Lots of questions.
So of course this is a really heavy decision to make. Generally speaking, commercial fishermen do not call for assistance unless their life is already at risk. So Phil believed that Skip wasn't looking at the situation with enough urgency. Again, everyone needs a friend like Phil. Without responding directly to Skip, Phil contacted the Coast Guard using his VHF radio. Everyone on their CB channel could hear the exchange of information as Phil relayed Skip's name, location, vessel name, and then answered a series of questions the Coast Guard had. After several moments, the quick response from the Coast Guard that they were on their way had Skip feeling nervous but relieved. Then determination washed over him. He put on his survival suit and then stood at the ready, waiting for the Coast Guard to arrive and willing to do all that he could to help them as much as they were helping him. The survival suit is a neoprene coverall which covers a person's body from head to foot. It has boots to put your feet in, a single mitt for your hands, and a hood to cover your head so that only your face is exposed. Neoprene is a type of pliable rubber which is waterproof and can sustain very cold temperatures. The survival suits are bright orange with reflective patches and are made to help prevent a person in the water from experiencing hypothermia, and some will also have a flotation device made to help keep your head above water.
Every fisherman should have one of those.
I think the majority do. For people who, I don't think I mentioned this at the beginning of the episode, but I read a book. This is technically it's the first story in the book, but I did the second story first, which was episode, I think 17. And then there's a future story that is coming probably in November, December timeframe about 3 different rescue attempts that occurred in the same area. Every single person had a survival suit. Even in the first story that I covered, which I believe again was episode 17, there was a child involved and the child had a survival suit. So it seems like people are like, yeah, like this is something important to have. Maybe it might even be a requirement. If you have a boat, it might be a requirement in Alaska. In order to assist, the Coast Guard had a C-130 search and rescue airplane arrive on scene, equipped with a CB radio so that way they could talk directly with Skip. The C-130 is a 4-engine plane used by the military in civilian and combat search and rescue operations. They were flying at around 18,000 feet, and when they first talked to Skip, he started to imply that he thought that this was a lost cause and there was no way that they would be able to get a basket down to him. Co-pilot Lieutenant Jim Hatfield brushed this off and told him not to worry, but also not to be surprised if he felt a bit of a shock when the basket got to him. It was just static electricity. So this plane was circling above where Skip was. So that way, instead of Skip talking to Phil, who then talked to the Coast Guard,
this plane could just talk directly to the Coast Guard.
Yes.
Real live time here.
Yes. So giving directions to Skip, Lieutenant Hatfield helped Skip prepare the boat for the best rescue operation they could feasibly try for, including taking down the antenna so that way the basket wire wouldn't get caught up in it. But this also would mean that the reach of Skip's CB radio would become even smaller. At about 1 a.m., August 7th, 1981, several hours after the call, an H-3 Pelican Sikorsky helicopter was seen in the distance.
The emotion here.
Oh, for sure.
Like, oh, I'm putting on my neoprene suit. They're coming. Hope.
Yeah.
I'm bailing out. I got all the water out. Engine doesn't start. Like this up and down of, I'm going to live. I'm going to die. I'm going to live. I'm going to die.
And it doesn't end.
And we don't know how it's going to end.
I know how this ends.
Same.
You know how this ends. So an H-3 Pelican is a amphibious helicopter, meaning that it can land and take off from both land and water. And this helicopter really helped the Coast Guard to be able to maneuver in more dangerous offshore rescues. On the right side, closer to the front than the back, is a large sliding cargo door that opens, which then allows a hoist arm to swing out, lock into place, and from there, a basket could be lowered and raised with a hydraulic system to assist in rescues where it wasn't the best move to put a rescuer on a line and down into the situation. The helicopter could accommodate at minimum 2 crew, the pilot and co-pilot, and then 6 people in the back, potentially more if needed. But most crew at this time was made up of a pilot, co-pilot, mechanic, and a navigator. In current day situations, they also tend to have a rescue swimmer on board, which are people who are literally trained to go into these horrendous waters and rescue people themselves, which is a whole nother thing.
Well, and I feel like you would, in this situation, like, right, we have to go back to the winds were 90 miles per hour at this point, right? These baskets, they're light. It's going to blow around.
It's not going where you want it to.
You can't navigate it.
Yeah.
Once it gets to a certain point in these winds.
Yeah.
Basket's not sounding like a great idea. And who wants to take a ride in a basket in 90 mile an hour winds?
Not me.
Same. I don't need coasters.
Same. So when the Coast Guard got the call, this helicopter was already in the air. Pilot Lieutenant Pat Rivas, co-pilot Lieutenant Joe Sposia, flight mechanic Scott Finfrock, and navigator John Snyder had been on a training flight, and they got this call and just changed course immediately. Skip stepped out to stand on the deck of the fishing vessel Marlene and watched as the helicopter came closer. And as it did, he could hear how hard the engine was working. In his words, the blades were producing an impossibly loud whining, a kind of metallic screaming. Between the spray from the sea and the wind and the rain, it was nearly impossible to see. The waves were reaching 25 feet high, or nearly 8 meters, and the current continued to pull Skip further out into the Gulf of Alaska. As Lieutenant Rivas and Lieutenant Sposia tried to control the helicopter in an attempted hover overhead, Skip suddenly found himself being yanked up and realized that he had been caught by a rogue wave. A rogue wave, in simple terms, is a wave that shoots up unpredictably and is often much larger than the waves around it. Just as the fishing vessel Marlene began her descent, the helicopter's floodlights flicked on, and from the crest of the waves, Skip could see that he was even with the helicopter hovering 100 feet away. Inside the helicopter, things were starting to malfunction. Their Lawrence C navigational computer had already shut down on their way to Skip, but now their radar had shut down and one of their onboard radios had shut down as well. Minutes went by. Again, the helicopter tried to maintain control in the 90 mile per hour winds or 145 kilometer per hour winds when suddenly a sandbag attached to a line hit the deck next to Skip. This line was called a tending line, and the Coast Guard often uses this as a way to feed the basket down to someone needing rescue. Kind of circling back to how you mentioned that the baskets, when there's wind, they just kind of go all over the place. So this is kind of their way to direct the basket where it needs to go.
You have to wonder too. So if you look at the conditions of the helicopter, they can't radio for help to say that they need to abandon this mission and send another helicopter in.
Yeah.
So now they're throwing this, they have impending doom happening.
Yep.
On their own.
Yep.
While still trying to be heroes for Skip because he's standing there waiting.
Yep.
And doesn't know what's going on in the helicopter. So they throw the sandbag down, and is this their attempt also to kind of anchor themselves? Because there's a lot of things going on that they can foresee. I mean, they're well trained, right? They can foresee what's going to happen here.
Their only working radio system was what they could communicate with the C-130 plane above them. Their priority was not, let's communicate what's going on in here. So all of this information is based solely on what investigators could figure out from the recovery of the helicopter and what Skip experienced and what conversations they had with the 130. And so the downside is we don't know what was going on in their minds in these moments other than doing everything they could to rescue Skip.
So having climbed in a car upside down this morning, anything could have been happening, right? I wasn't thinking about someone behind me was even saying, be careful, Michelle, there's broken glass, like right by your right leg. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm sitting in this car with this 80-year-old woman, and I'm not thinking about myself.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking I need to keep her talking. I need to keep her calm. I need to make sure she feels safe.
Yeah. And
all the while wasn't really even paying attention to whether I was safe.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're thinking, okay, if we throw this down, this could anchor us. We do have the C-130 ahead of us, but they're just trying to figure out how they're going to save Skip.
Yeah. And there's almost like, I know you can probably attest to this, but I know I've done other episodes where a nurse is involved and they're like, you shut down emotion and you just do the work. And that is how you get through some of these really traumatic circumstances. And I'm sure that for people who work in search and rescue, the same thing happens. They shut down those emotions and go into work mode and get the job done. And so that's probably where they're at, is there's a job to do, you get it done, and we will process later.
You compartmentalize.
Skip saw this sandbag and he thought to himself that maybe if they can't get the basket down to him, then if he held on to the line, they would be able to pull him up. So I also want to come back to the survival suit. Basically has a mitten. The mitten is made of rubber, right? And how poor your grip is going to be having your hand inside of a mitten that's made of rubber and trying to hold on to a rope that probably isn't that thick. And so in my head, who is not in the situation, I'm like, there's no way that would work. There's no way that grabbing that line and having them pull you up to the helicopter, you're not going to make it.
You don't think that you'd be able to hold on to the rope tighter with the rubber?
No.
Okay. I almost want to wear rubber mitts to the gym, and
we'll get you a survival suit, Michelle.
Do you pull ups? My neoprene survival suit.
Let's
You don't have the dexterity. You don't have the fine motor control.
Right.
Because you're enclosed in a mitten. But I'm wondering if does the rubber.
I don't think it locks you in.
Okay.
I don't think so.
See, I have some hope here. Like I'm
okay.
I'm on Skip's hope plane here.
Okay. You're with Skip for the moment.
I'm with Skip for the moment.
So Skip grabs the line and decides to pull a little to see if it's attached to anything on the other end of the helicopter. And just as he was doing that, a gust of wind overpowered the helicopter and had it shooting backwards, with the pilot and co-pilot fighting to gain control. The line that Skip held in his hands wasn't attached to anything in the helicopter and snaked down to the ocean as it was pulled free from the helicopter. Again, Skip can see the helicopter gaining ground as it again comes to yet another hover, and this time he can see the mechanic, Scott, maneuver the basket out the door. Another gust of wind and the helicopter is flying backwards again. And the entire time, Skip is just standing there helpless. He tried so desperately to help his rescuers as much as he could, and he didn't even have a way to communicate with them. Again and again and again, the helicopter was plucked away as if it was a toy, and the winds were a guiding hand. The wind had now reached over 100 miles per hour, or 161 kilometers per hour. Lieutenant Rivas radioed up to Lieutenant Dale Harrington, who was the pilot on the C-130 circling overhead, saying that they were going to try one more time, but he was nearly at his mental capacity. The seas were big, the boat was small, and Lieutenant Rivas just felt like he was out of options. But they went back. This time, though, Skip notices that the whining of the helicopter has now turned to a grinding. Again,
he can't tell them that they actually are probably in more danger than he is.
Yeah, there's no way. So because Skip took his antenna down,
right,
there's no way for him to communicate with anyone. Again, the helicopter was blown back. Skip, standing on the deck, watched in horror as the helicopter hovered momentarily and then tipped sideways and fell from the sky. Skip could see the navigational light from the helicopter in the water and decided that he couldn't just sit there. These men needed someone to rescue them or they were dead. He ran back to his wheelhouse, desperately cranking the engine over and over, but it refused to start. Remember, Skip had to remove his antenna at the start of this rescue attempt, so now his reach with his CB radio was very small. He still called out a mayday, desperately trying to let someone know what had happened. In a particularly devastating relay of messages, Skip's friend Phil could hear Skip but not respond to him. Phil then contacted the C-130 co-pilot, Lieutenant Hatfield, and let him know what happened. The only response that he received from the lieutenant was that of a sob. Just as Skip's CB radio battery was, Skip's voice came through with the broken words of a cry, "Don't send anyone else, no more."
So now he's just relinquishing to die.
Yes.
All hope is lost.
For him, his life is not worth it for anybody else to come and die trying to save him. The helicopter's tail rotor blades had been clipped by a wave as it was blown backwards by a gust of wind, shearing off the tail of the helicopter. This then sent the helicopter into a catastrophic failure as it tipped to the side. Seconds later, when the main blades hit the ocean water, they exploded on impact, and with all of the heavy equipment being located towards the top of the helicopter, it was weighed down upside down. The waters were 44 degrees Fahrenheit or 6 degrees Celsius, but every man on board fought against the onslaught of frigid and treacherous waters. This temperature of water means that you have a very short window to be rescued before hypothermia would render you unconscious, which would take about an hour. By the time dawn came, the winds had settled down to nearly 50 miles per hour or 80 kilometers per hour, which is still quite high.
Very high. I wouldn't say that that's calm, but
no,
here we are.
Calmer. In comparison, they're calm. So in a cruel stroke of luck, Skip tried his engine again, and this time it came to life. Skip decided to see if he could go find anyone from the helicopter crew in the water, and so he went to pull in his gill net. As a fisher, finding it full of salmon would have normally brought a smile to his face. This time he grabbed his hatchet and cut the net away, not wanting to waste the time he had to rescue anyone needing help. Miraculously, Skip also found that his steering had returned. Angling the fishing vessel Marlene, he made his way toward where he saw the helicopter go down. About an hour later, he found it. The helicopter was floating semi-submerged upside down, and it didn't take long before Skip spotted a man floating face down in the water. He was in what is called a dead man's float and was somehow tethered to the helicopter, for as the helicopter slowly descended deeper into the waters, the man was pulled down with it. Realizing that there was nothing he could do, he continued looking, and 3 hours later, another boat approached. This was Andy Halverson, who came to the area in search of Skip. Andy had heard over the radio that Skip was in trouble and 4 United States Coast Guard men were dead. As soon as dawn came, a rescue mission was launched to search for the 4 Coast Guard men. 31-year-old Lieutenant Joe Sposia had exited the helicopter without being in his survival suit and likely suffered from hypothermia, quickly being overcome by the waves. 21-year-old John Snyder likely lived for several hours as he had been wearing his survival suit. However, he didn't inflate the flotation collar, probably due to head injuries during the crash. It was suspected that he drowned due to being incapacitated from his injuries. 33-year-old Lieutenant Pat Rivas, whose real first name was Ernie, exited the aircraft despite having shattered the C6 vertebrae in his neck. This was likely caused by being thrown forward during the crash and colliding with the instrument panel in front of him. Despite not having a survival suit on, he gave himself the best chance that he could at survival and removed his steel-toed boots, probably trying to keep him from being weighed down while he tried to swim. It isn't known who, but someone returned into the submerged helicopter to pull their life raft free. But once blown up by its CO2 canister, the wind immediately began to blow it away, assuming Pat swam after it. The following day, during a search for the missing men, the raft in perfect condition was found washed ashore on Montague Island, and Pat's body was found face down and partially buried in the sand next to it. 25-year-old Scott Finfrock, who was working the basket hoist, was next to the open door when the helicopter plummeted into the water. He would have been the first out and was wearing his survival suit, an extra pair of booties, and a survival vest, giving him the best chance to survive the cold waters. But he too did not inflate his neck pillow. When his body was found, they saw that tied to him was 30 feet of rope, which is surmised to have also been tied to the helicopter, so he was likely the one who Skip found floating in the water. Due to the bad weather, the bodies were not found for 2 days, first with Rivas and Snyder being found washed ashore. It wasn't until day 5 that Scott's body was found, and then after 10 days of searching, Sposia's body was found, concluding the search for the missing crew. Skip was able to return to land all on his own. This particular storm raged over Prince William Sound in 1981, still stands as one of the most powerful storms to hit the area. Over the course of 3 days, a total of 14 inches of rain fell from the skies, and this is the fastest the area has ever received this volume of rain.
It's really sad.
Mm-hmm.
And they knew they were going to die.
Oh, for sure. I think, of course, you can't know in all circumstances, but I think a lot of people know when it's happening, even if they don't want to admit it.
Yeah.
I think.
They still pressed on. Like he said, I'm at my capacity, but I'm going to try one more time.
Yeah.
And you have to wonder, did he consult his crew? Did they make that decision together quickly? Or as the captain, did he just say, we're doing this one more time?
Yeah. And I mean, I have so many questions because there's also the factor that, they were already flying when they got the call and decided to respond to the call. What was the gas situation like? I mean, in terms of how they responded, was there any way that they could have potentially led to a better outcome? I think the hardest part for me to wrap my head around is that Skip's boat worked just fine the following morning.
Right.
And so
Skip, and so, we're wrapped up in the death of, the Coast Guard men.
Yeah.
Which I believe there's a memorial on a rock.
Yeah.
I looked it up, and I do believe that there is some sort of memorial. But Skip survived all night.
Yeah.
He went through this.
Yeah.
Knowing that these men were dead.
And watched them crash and watched them die. And we've talked a couple of times about like the amount of emotion that you go through, but then carrying that, knowing these guys gave their lives trying to rescue me. And then the next morning, my engine worked, my steering worked, and I was too late to save them.
Right.
how
that's heavy,
devastating that would be to a person. I know that I would have a hard time with that. And based on the information that we know, I'm assuming that Skip also had a hard time processing that.
I wonder if Skip continued fishing.
That's a good question. Anybody have any information about Skip Holden in Alaska, Prince William Sound?
I bet. I mean, I'm sure there are Alaska Facebook pages.
That's a good idea.
Right? Like, we're going to go to Hawaii next year. And so I've been getting on.
Are you going with Amanda?
Yes.
Nice.
You want to come?
I want to, but I probably won't be able to. I want to, but I think I won't be able to.
We're starting a GoFundMe page for Kayla to go to Hawaii.
Yeah. Buying a house and getting married in the same year is already expensive things.
Yes.
And
that might take priority.
Going on a honeymoon.
You mean you don't want to live on a $1,200 boat?
Listen, I have lived in weird places, but Sam will not live.
I can see that.
So this episode, we're recording this like right before it's releasing. So won't be in this episode, but I'm going to look into it and maybe I'll do like a quick update. Well, thanks for doing this with me, Michelle.
My pleasure.
It was fun.
It was fun.
Both times.
Twice. Double the fun.
So, yeah, everyone, thank you for listening and bye.
Bye.
What is life without close calls with disaster? Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow the podcast to be the first to hear the now weekly episodes. Join our subscription on Patreon, Apple, or Spotify today and immerse yourself in the haunting beauty of the great outdoors. For around $4 a month, you'll get exclusive access to the first episode of each month and early access to all other episodes, showcasing the morbid and mysterious side of nature. Please reach out with story requests, and if you have your own story, please email tragedywithaview@gmail.com for a chance to have your story featured on a later episode. Again, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.